very important if we're speaking with someone about this issue to remember it could well be a serious and sincere question, and it could be someone who's faced some kind of sexual violence themselves. It's very important that we speak to the heart, not just the mind. We don't want to win an argument but lose a person. We don't want to be insensitive. We want to treat people with dignity and respect. What if a woman is raped? Scott Klusendorf wrote The Case for Life, an excellent book on how to engage in constructive conversations about abortion, how to answer tricky questions, the underpinning for the value of human life in the first place. And he says in his chapter introducing this whole issue, whenever possible, I take questions from the audience after my talks. I don't need to guess what the first one will be because it's nearly always the same. And he goes on to bring to the table the sort of rape objection. And that's certainly been our experience in our public education work. It's probably the most common question or objection we get. So what if a woman's raped? And this is a really difficult subject to be talking about today. It's important to be talking about, and I'm going to explain in a few moments why in particular I'm talking about this today. But it's worth just looking at the question more generally first before we go on to looking at why we're talking about it, especially today, because it is a question that comes up all the time, and it's important to know how we respond to this question. Something very helpful in the way that Scott deals with it is he distinguishes between two different kinds of people who ask this question. And the reason I said question or objection, I meant that rather deliberately because it can be used as a genuine question, or it can be used as an objection or even as a sort of trump card. It's very important we understand, where's this question coming from? Is it a genuine question? Scripture says not to answer a fool according to his folly. So we need to understand, is someone asking this in a foolish way, using the word foolish in the biblical sense, morally degenerate way, or is this an honest question? So Scott distinguishes between the so-called crusader and the so-called learner. The crusader, the pro-abortion activist, is not asking this question because they genuinely want to hear what you have to say. They're asking this because they want to paint you in the worst possible light, and they want to find an excuse to dismiss you, and therefore your message is actually being used as a kind of ad hominem. It's designed to say, look everyone, at what a monster this guy is. No one needs to listen to him because he's just so evil and insensitive. It's very important that we distinguish as far as is possible, and there are ways to tell whether the person in front of us is asking it sincerely. And here's one great way you can find out. Say you can't tell. Often you can, because if they're shouting at you and if they're not listening to what you're saying in response, then you can begin to piece together, okay, these aren't really questions, these are just bullets. But if you're not too sure, here's a way you can find out. You can say to your to the person you're speaking with, okay, let's say, for sake of argument, we allow for abortion in cases of rape. Okay, we allow those. Would you stand with me in opposing abortion in all other circumstances? Now, the crusader will instantly say, no, I wouldn't stand with you in that. I think it's up to her. It's her choice. It's her body. It's nothing to do with you, and so on. And what you've done there is you've exposed where they're really coming from. They don't really care about rape. In fact, they're just trying to exploit the awful suffering of the victims of rape as a kind of rhetorical trick to try and paint you in a bad light. They don't care about the victims of rape because it was never about that. They're just trying to use that to justify all abortions and to distract from all abortions, because that's what they're actually campaigning for. So by saying, okay, for sake of argument, let's say that's permissible. Would you stand with me against the rest? You're discerning who this is in front of you and where this question is coming from. It's really important not to rush past that, because you might think you know what their question is, but often it's not really what you think it is, because it's not what it is on the surface. And Jesus was very skillful, wasn't he, in not answering people's questions at face value, but getting to the heart of the person he was speaking with, seeing where the question was coming from and attacking that issue. Where's the question coming from? Where is he going with this? So having distinguished between the crusader and the learner, if it's a crusader, refuse to play ball. Okay, well, if you're actually campaigning for that, I'm not going to talk about rape, because it's not about that. Let's talk about why you support killing a baby up to birth for any or no reason. Would you support killing a baby just after birth? And so on and so forth. But the learner will respond quite differently. The learner will say, no, I'm with you against all those other abortions. I believe in the sanctity of life. I think abortion's a horrific act of violence. But what about rape? Okay, now you know you're talking to someone who's got a sincere question, and their ears are open and they're wanting to learn. And I'm not going to go over this too much, because previous episodes have looked at this. You can go back and see our tutorials on how to speak about abortion, how to have a conversation. We've looked at answering tricky questions and so on. But just by way of reminder, trotting out the toddler is so helpful, but don't forget to use your common ground first. It's very important, if we're speaking with someone about this issue, to remember it could well be a serious and sincere question, and it could be someone who's faced some kind of sexual violence themselves. It's very important that we speak to the heart, not just the mind. We don't want to win an argument but lose a person. We don't want to be insensitive. We want to treat people with dignity and respect and take seriously. This could be, and I've had many conversations with women who have been the victims of rape, out on the streets, public education work, in churches, whatever. In the context of speaking about abortion, I've spoken with many women who have been raped. It's so important we acknowledge that. So we've got to tread very carefully here. We're dealing with real people and real trauma. So it's very important to remember common ground. We need to empathize. We owe that to them. We want to treat the person we're speaking with dignity, whether they're for abortion or against. We treat them with dignity. They're made in the image of God. So common ground. We've got to acknowledge just what a horrific crime rape is. It's one of the worst. And I have no idea what it must be like to be the victim of that. It's unimaginable. And we have to articulate an acknowledgement of that situation. Common ground is so important. After common ground, we have analogy and we have question. Analogy, trot out the toddler. But imagine with me, if you will, that a woman who's been the victim of rape, she does conceive, she chooses to keep the child. The child is now 1 or 2, and the child is still reminding her of this trauma. Would it be okay? Would it be a humane solution to that problem to take a knife and to kill that child at the age of 1 or 2? That's your question. So analogy, trot out the toddler, always finish with a question. And most people will say, especially if they're being honest, no, of course not. That's not the solution. And then we ask, well, what's the difference? And what we need people to see is that the child's humanity is in no way affected by the fact that their father committed a crime. And that's why we're talking about it today, because the BBC has published 1 or 2 very interesting stories in recent days about how the children conceived through rape are now to be recognised as victims of that rape. They are also being considered, along with their mothers, they also are being considered as victims of that crime. And this is a really interesting development here in our nation. In some countries, horrific to say, in some cultures, if a woman is raped, the woman is put to death in a kind of shame, honor killing. It's as if the woman is punished for the man's crime in some cultures. And I think most of us would find that absolutely abhorrent. Capital punishment for the innocent woman. In other cultures, the man might be punished with capital punishment. The man might be put to death. Now, some might agree with that, some might not. But in our culture, so often it's the baby, the innocent third party, that's being put to death through abortion. Indeed, it's such an assumption that abortion is the solution, or at least could be the solution in the case of a baby being conceived through rape. It's such an assumption that it's used as a sort of trump card in debates and out on the streets and wherever. Oh, what about rape? Are you saying even in the case of rape? So it's seen as the strongest, probably, justification for abortion. But when you actually examine it, what we're talking about here is inflicting capital punishment on the innocent third party, the baby, instead of punishing the one who actually committed the crime. Now, I'll put a link in the description about a book called Victors and Victims, which interestingly questions even just the assumption that abortion is what women themselves want after being the victims of rape, and whether it even helps them. There's a really interesting string of quotes from mothers and overwhelmingly, this study is showing women who conceive through rape are choosing to keep their children. They don't want abortion, most of them, and they're overwhelmingly happy they did keep the child and found it a source of healing. Now, the interesting thing about this article that's come out from the BBC is in the same vein, or in a similar vein, it is seeking to rehumanize and acknowledge not only the innocence and the value of children conceived through rape, but it's even going further and saying they need to be recognized as victims themselves. So I'll put the link in the description here, but it was just out a couple of days ago on the BBC, and here's the news story. Children conceived as a result of rape will soon be recognised as victims of crime in England and Wales, the government says. And then what it has is, it says people share their stories here of being born to mothers who were raped. Now, what's really interesting here is stories are now being told from the perspective of the baby. Now, usually the what about rape question is focusing only on the mother, and they refuse to acknowledge the reality of the life of the baby. But here in the BBC article, the people it's talking about, they're the babies. So we're hearing about this from the perspective of these babies who've now grown up and they're teenagers or they're adults. And it says that here they explain why they refuse to let the past dictate their lives. The forthcoming Victims Bill covering England and Wales will officially classify children conceived as a result of rape as victims of crime. This will entitle them to extra support. An interesting comment in the article is that there are no charities or support services dedicated to the children of rape victims in the UK. Isn't that interesting? We're in a culture that hitherto has said the answer for a child conceived through rape is to kill them. That's all we offer. Not a single charity, no government provision up until now to help those who are the victims of rape, as in the children conceived. Now, what follows in the article is some difficult reading, descriptions of what it's like to find out that you are a child who was conceived in an act of rape, and also some very hard to read descriptions of the, not terribly graphic, but descriptions of the sexual violence itself. And it makes for difficult reading, but it's important reading, because injustice is injustice. Evil is evil, and it needs to be exposed. And whether that's violence against a woman through an act of rape, or if it's violence against a child through an act of violence that we call abortion, injustice must be opposed. Now, listen to the way this is described. The moment that some of these children actually found out how they were conceived. Finding out they had been conceived in such a violent, hateful way feels, and here's the quote, almost like somebody's punched into your chest and ripped your insides out. Okay, so not only is the rape itself an act of violence, but actually finding out that you are a child conceived through rape is akin to an act of violence. So upsetting and gutting, or it's literally gutting the way it's described there, is it? Now, the interesting thing here is that something being punched into your chest and your insides being ripped out is actually quite an accurate description of the violence of abortion, which is the solution, so-called, our society generally offers, or even just assumes is the only solution, for a child conceived through rape. Surgical abortion involves the live dismemberment, the disemboweling, the decapitation of a child in the womb. And the BBC generally has reported on abortion very, very positively, very supportive of the killing of unborn children. But here we're seeing that very same person, victim, the unborn child, now humanized and actually acknowledged as a victim, and it's all empathy. Another story goes like this. A child said, "Mum," at a certain age, the child said, "Mum, am I a rape baby?" The mother turns to look at her eldest son sitting next to her in the car. She wants to help him, to protect him from this pain, but she doesn't know how. "No," she says, "you're my baby." And there's a theme right throughout the article, through all these testimonies, of mothers refusing to allow this act of violence to define, to set a value on their child. And so that's a motif we see again and again. No, he's not a rapist's baby. That's not what defines him. He's my baby. I'm a mother. He's my child. His value is not dictated by an act of violence. And it's fantastic to see this sort of argumentation taking place in the public square, that our value is not dictated by the circumstances of our conception. Very, very difficult reading was one case of incestuous rape. Very difficult reading. A father with his own child. And she described, she conceived from her own father, horrific. And again, she described this act of violence, and she said, it's like if you inject poison into somebody. That's what my father did to me. He injected our own genes into me. Horrific. Horrific stuff. An act of violence at so many levels. But again, interesting how this language of injecting poison is used of this act of violence. It's legitimate. But in another BBC article, we'll find the defense of abortion, even late-term abortion, which does involve literally the injecting of poison into an unborn child, a lethal injection to the heart. We talked last week about cognitive dissonance. We're hearing it again today. She went on to have that child, and here's what she said. "He was my baby. He was precious. I was going to protect him forever." And she actually had a chance to run away from her father, which she did, and she has kept the child and is described as living very happily now with the child and some other children that she now has with her husband. He wasn't conceived out of love, she said. He wasn't conceived out of my love. He was conceived by a monster, but by God, I love him. And she may be saying by God as an exclamation here, but unwittingly perhaps she's saying something rather profound. By God's design, we're created with this incredible paternal or maternal instinct. And it is part of the natural order, even in the most horrific circumstances, that we should love the children entrusted to us. She goes on, you can read the whole article, I'll link it. But the point of this again and again, two things I just want to draw out as I close, keeping this brief today. Two things. Firstly, it is good. It is a very good thing that we're seeing here the humanity of these children conceived through rape, explored, described, celebrated, and their suffering acknowledged. That they have been victims, that the effect of their father's crime wasn't just that they came into existence, but it's also difficult for them at many levels, even at a biological, physical level, in the case of that child who was conceived in such a horrific way. So it is good. It's a good thing. And you can go back and listen to our recent podcast, Problem Pregnancies in the Bible, where we explore this fact that's right throughout Scripture. No matter how problematic or horrific the circumstances of conception, that's not what defines us. It's not what gives us our value. And so it's encouraging to see, by God's common grace, by perhaps the echoes of, even in this kind of post-Christian culture, the echoes of a Christian worldview that does uphold the dignity of all human beings, still coming through and still making its presence known. And we can thank God for that. It's a good thing. And this article is worth sharing to rehumanize those who are conceived through acts of violence. But the second thing, of course, is this great inconsistency. The BBC which will promote abortion, the killing of unborn children, and certainly in the case of rape, here is saying, no, let's not victimize these people. Let's acknowledge them as victims and get them help. And so again, we're seeing two very opposite trajectories here. And so let's hope and pray that the government wakes up to the fact that it is simultaneously recognizing as victims those conceived through rape, and at the same time actively victimizing these secondary, if you want to call them that, victims of rape, by killing them in the womb. These two polar opposites, these opposite trajectories happening at the same time. And as with the miscarriage contradiction we looked at last week, on the one hand, we should celebrate the progress, celebrate the rehumanizing as just a good thing in and of itself. But we should also celebrate it because it heightens the tension. It exposes the great contradiction that's taking place of becoming more and more sort of deafening in our culture. And we need to point out that inconsistency in the hope of more progress. Why not write to your MP about this story and say, hey, if we're acknowledging these people as victims, shouldn't we stop killing them because of the crimes of their father as well? Better still, why don't you go ahead and join the movement? Go to cbruk.org/join. That's JOIN. You can join the movement and join teams wherever you are in the country that are educating members of the public on the reality of life in the womb, the humanity of the unborn child, the horrors of what we call abortion, what's happening to these babies, and highlighting not only the humanity but the value of every human being made in the image of God. Join us in standing for truth and standing for life. You can go ahead and do that today. Go to cbruk.org/join. Thank you for listening.